The morning sun filtered through the stained-glass windows of St. Catherine's Convent, casting colorful patterns across the old stone floor. Sister Margaret shuffled slowly down the hallway, her worn black shoes making soft sounds on the cold tiles. At 73 years old, she had walked these same corridors for almost half a century, but today something felt different. She paused outside the chapel door, her weathered hand resting on the heavy wooden frame. From inside came the gentle sound of her fellow sisters preparing for morning prayers. But there was something else too, something that made her heart skip a beat. The beautiful grand piano that had arrived 3 months ago sat in the corner, its polished black surface gleaming in the morning light. Sister Margaret remembered the day it arrived like it was yesterday. A wealthy businessman from the nearby town had donated it to the convent after his mother passed away. He said his mother had always loved church music and wanted her piano to bring joy to others. The delivery men had struggled to get it through the narrow doorway, and all the sisters had gathered to watch as they carefully positioned it in the chapel, but their excitement had been short-lived. Mother Superior, the strict leader of their small community, had taken one look at the instrument and shaken her head. "This is too fancy for our simple way of life," she had declared. "We are here to serve God through prayer and work, not through worldly entertainment. Our voices are enough for worship." The piano had sat untouched ever since, like a beautiful bird trapped in a cage. Sister Margaret often found herself staring at it during prayers, wondering what melodies might flow from its keys. She could almost hear the music in her mind, but the rules were clear. No one was allowed to play it. What Mother Superior didn't know was that Sister Margaret had once been quite the pianist. As a young girl growing up in a small farmhouse outside the village, she had learned to play on her grandmother's old upright piano. It was nothing fancy. The wood was scratched and some of the keys stuck, but to young Margaret, it had been the most wonderful thing in the world. Her grandmother, Nonna Rosa, had been her teacher. Every afternoon after school, Margaret would run to her grandmother's house and climb onto the piano bench. Nonna Rosa would sit beside her, her gentle hands guiding Margaret's small fingers across the keys. "Music is like prayer, little one," Nonna Rosa used to say. "It comes from the heart and goes straight to heaven." Margaret had learned to play hymns, first simple melodies that filled the small farmhouse with warmth. Then came folk songs that made everyone smile, and eventually more complex pieces that challenged her growing skills. Her grandmother always said she had a special gift, that her fingers seemed to know exactly where to go on the keys, but those days felt like a lifetime ago. When Margaret was 26, she had felt called to dedicate her life to God. She had traded her simple dresses for the black habit of a nun, and her grandmother's piano for a life of prayer and service. It had been the right choice. She had never doubted that, but sometimes, in quiet moments like this, she missed the music terribly. The other sisters began filing into the chapel for morning prayers, and Sister Margaret quickly took her usual seat in the third row. She tried to focus on the prayers, but her eyes kept drifting to the piano. The morning light made its surface shine like water, and she could see her own reflection in its polished wood. During the silent prayer time, she found herself remembering a particular song Nonna Rosa had taught her, a beautiful melody about hope that always made people cry happy tears. Her fingers, now wrinkled and marked with age spots, began to move slightly on her lap, playing the invisible keys from memory. "Sister Margaret," whispered Sister Anna, the young nun sitting beside her. "Are you feeling all right?" Margaret quickly stilled her hands and nodded, embarrassed to be caught daydreaming. But as the morning prayers continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring inside her, something that had been sleeping for far too long after prayers. As the sisters went about their daily tasks, Margaret found herself walking past the chapel more often than usual. Each time she would glance through the doorway at the piano, and each time her heart would ache a little more. That evening, after dinner and evening prayers, most of the sisters retired to their simple rooms. But Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the old building settling around her. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she slipped quietly from her room. The corridors were dark except for the small oil lamps. that burned throughout the night. Margaret made her way carefully to the chapel, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The heavy wooden door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, and she froze, listening for any sign that she had woken someone. But the convent remained. Peaceful and quiet, inside the chapel, moonlight streamed through the windows, creating patterns of silver light on the floor. And there, in the corner, stood the piano, beautiful and silent, waiting. Margaret approached it slowly, almost as if she were in a dream. She had not been this close to it since the day it arrived. Up close, she could see that it was even more magnificent than she had realized. The wood was a deep, rich black, and the keys were like perfect white and black teeth. Gleaming in the moonlight, she reached out tentatively, then stopped. The rules were clear. Mother Superior had forbidden anyone to touch it, but surely just looking couldn't hurt. She moved closer, until she was standing right beside the piano bench. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface. An old woman with gray hair peeking out from beneath her head covering, deep lines around her eyes from years of smiling at the other sisters, hands that had spent decades in prayer and work. But for just a moment, she could see traces of the young girl who had once filled her grandmother's house with music. Margaret glanced around the empty chapel one more time, then carefully lifted the lid that covered the keys. The piano seemed to gleam even brighter, as if it were happy to finally have its voice revealed. She sat down on the bench, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it would wake the entire convent. Her hands hovered just inches above the keys. She could feel the music waiting inside the instrument, ready to pour out at the touch of her fingers. All she had to do was reach down and ... Sister Margaret. The sharp voice made her jump and spin around, her hands flying to her chest. Sister. Agnes stood in the doorway, her face stern in the lamplight. What are you doing here at this hour? Sister Agnes demanded, walking quickly into the chapel. And why is that piano open? Margaret's cheeks burned with shame. I couldn't sleep. And I came to pray. I was just looking at it. I didn't play anything, I promise. Sister Agnes looked at her suspiciously, then at the piano with its exposed keys. You know the rules, Sister Margaret. Mother Superior was very clear about this instrument. It's not for us to use? I know, Margaret whispered, carefully closing the piano lid. I'm sorry, I just wanted to see it up close. Sister Agnes studied her for a long moment, and Margaret thought she saw something soften in the other woman's expression. But then Sister Agnes straightened her shoulders and spoke firmly. Go back to your room now, sister, and please don't let this happen again. You know how Mother Superior feels about disobedience. Margaret nodded and hurried from the chapel, her face burning with embarrassment. But as she walked back to her room, something inside her had changed. For the first time in decades, the music that had been sleeping in her heart had begun to stir. And once awakened, she knew it would be impossible to make it sleep again. The days following Sister Margaret's late-night encounter with the piano felt different somehow. Every morning during prayers, she tried to keep her eyes focused on her prayer book, but they kept drifting toward the corner where the beautiful instrument sat silent and closed. The memory of those gleaming keys haunted her thoughts, and she found herself wondering what they might sound like under her touch. Sister Agnes had kept her word and hadn't told Mother Superior about finding Margaret in the chapel that night. But she watched the elderly nun carefully during meals and prayers, as if she suspected something was brewing beneath Margaret's quiet exterior. Margaret tried her best to act normal, but the music inside her head was growing louder each day. It started small at first. During her daily tasks in the convent kitchen, Margaret found herself humming softly while she kneaded bread or stirred soup. The melodies were ones her grandmother had taught her long ago, simple folk songs that seemed to make the work go faster. Sister Catherine, who worked alongside her, smiled when she heard the gentle humming. You have such a lovely voice. Sister Margaret, Catherine said one afternoon as they prepared vegetables for dinner. It reminds me of my own mother's singing when I was little. Margaret blushed and stopped humming immediately. Oh, I didn't realize I was making noise. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Sister Catherine laughed. It makes the kitchen feel warmer. Somehow, Please, keep singing if it makes you happy." But Margaret found it hard to be happy when the music in her heart had nowhere to go. The humming helped a little, but it wasn't enough. Her fingers had begun moving on their own during quiet moments, playing invisible piano keys on tabletops on her lap during prayers, even on the sides of her legs as she walked through the corridors. The other sisters started to notice these strange finger movements, though most were too polite to comment. Sister Anna, the youngest nun in their community, was the most curious about Margaret's behavior. "Sister Margaret," Anna said one evening, as they sat together mending torn habits in the common room, "forgive me for asking, but what are your hands doing? You keep moving your fingers like you're playing something." Margaret looked down at her hands in embarrassment. She hadn't even realized she was doing it again. Her fingers had been silently playing a bacham on the arm of her chair while Anna spoke. "It's nothing, dear," Margaret said quickly, folding her hands in her lap. "Just an old habit, I suppose," but Anna was persistent. "Were you a musician before you joined us? You move your fingers like someone who knows how to play piano." The question hit Margaret like a gentle punch to the chest. No one had ever asked her about her life before the convent in such direct terms. The sisters all knew bits and pieces of each other's stories, but they rarely talked about the past in detail. Yes, I played a little when I was young," Margaret admitted quietly. "My grandmother taught me on her old piano." But that was a very long time ago, and his eyes lit up with excitement. "How wonderful! I always wanted to learn piano, but my family was too poor to afford lessons." "What was it like?" Margaret felt her heart swell with memories. It was like Dyke being able to speak a different language. A language that came from your soul instead of your mouth. When you played the right notes in the right order, it could make people laugh or cry or feel hope when they had none. "That sounds beautiful," Anna said softly. "Do you miss it?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret looked around the simple common room with its plain wooden furniture and single oil lamp, then at the young nun's eager face. How could she explain the ache that had been growing in her chest for decades? How could she describe the way her hands longed to create music the way they once had? "Sometimes," she said finally, "but I chose this life and I'm grateful for it. God has given me so much here." That night, Margaret lay in her narrow bed, unable to sleep once again. But this time, instead of fighting the memories, she let them wash over her. She remembered sitting beside Nonna Rosa on the piano bench, her small hands trying to stretch across the keys to play chords that seemed impossible. She remembered the first time she played a song all the way through without making a mistake, and how her grandmother had clapped and cried with joy. She remembered the last song she ever played on that old piano, a sad, beautiful melody about saying goodbye. It was the day before she left for the convent, and her grandmother had asked her to play one final time. They had both cried that day, knowing it was the end of something precious. The next morning brought rain, which drummed steadily against the convent windows throughout the day. The gloomy weather matched Margaret's mood as she went about her duties. During the afternoon prayer service, she found herself staring at the piano again, wondering what it would sound like in the echoing chapel. Would the notes ring out clear and strong, or would they be muffled by the heavy stone walls? As if reading her thoughts, Mother Superior chose that moment to address the assembled sisters about the piano. "I want to remind everyone," the stern woman said, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel, "that the piano in our chapel is not for our use. It was a generous gift, and we are grateful for it, but it represents worldly pursuits that have no place in our spiritual life. We have our voices for worship, and that is sufficient." Margaret felt her cheeks burn as several sisters glanced in her direction. Did they know about her late-night visit to the chapel? Had Sister Agnes told someone after all? Mother Superior continued, "I've heard rumors that some of you have been curious about this instrument. Let me be clear, it is off limits to everyone. We are here to serve God through prayer, work, and simple living. Musical instruments are distractions from our true purpose." The words felt like stones thrown at Margaret's heart. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were trembling slightly in her lap. Around her, the other sisters murmured their agreement with Mother Superior's words, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to speak after the service as the sisters filed out of the chapel. Margaret lingered behind. She needed a moment alone to collect herself before facing the others. When the chapel was finally empty, she walked slowly to the piano and stood before it, her heart heavy with longing and frustration. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the silent instrument. "I'm sorry you have to stay quiet when you have so much music inside you." She reached out and gently touched the closed lid, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingertips. For just a moment, she imagined she could feel the piano's sadness too, a beautiful voice trapped and unable to sing. From that day forward, Margaret's secret visits to the chapel became more frequent. She never opened the piano again or sat on the bench, but she would stand beside it during her sleepless nights, placing her hands on its surface and imagining the melodies that lived within. Sometimes she would hum very softly, pretending the piano was humming along with her. The other sisters began to worry about her. She had grown quieter during meals, more distant during their shared work time. Her fingers never stopped their invisible playing, and sometimes they caught her staring off into space with a look of such longing that it made their hearts ache for her. Sister Catherine approached her one evening after dinner, concern written across her kind face. "Sister Margaret, we're all worried about you. You seem so sad lately. Is there anything we can do to help?" Margaret looked at the faces of her fellow sisters, women who had become her family over the decades. They loved her, she knew, and wanted her to be happy. But how could she explain that happiness felt impossible when the music in her soul had nowhere to go? "I'm fine," she said with a weak smile. "Just feeling my age, I suppose." But deep down, Margaret knew she wasn't fine. The music inside her was growing stronger every day, demanding to be heard, and she was beginning to wonder how much longer she could keep it locked away. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual chill in the air. Sister Margaret woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 47 years, but something felt different about this particular morning. The autumn wind rattled the old windows of the convent, and dark clouds gathered overhead, promising rain before the day was through. As she dressed in her simple black habit, Margaret felt a strange flutter in her chest, not quite nervousness, but something close to it. Today was the monthly community service, when the local villagers would join the sisters for morning prayers and hymns. It was always one of Margaret's favorite days, seeing the familiar faces of the townspeople who had become like extended family over the years, but today would be different. And Margaret didn't yet know why. The sisters gathered in the kitchen for their simple breakfast of bread and tea. Before the service began, the usual morning chatter was quieter than normal, and Margaret noticed several of her fellow nuns glancing toward the windows at the darkening sky. "Looks like we might have quite a storm today," Sister Catherine observed, spreading a thin layer of honey on her bread. "I hope Brother Thomas makes it here safely from the monastery." Brother Thomas was their regular organist, a kind man in his 60s who traveled from the neighboring monastery every Sunday to play for their community service. His music was simple but heartfelt, and the villagers had grown to love his gentle hymns that seemed to make even the oldest voices sound beautiful when they sang together. "He's never missed a Sunday in 15 years, Sister Anna said confidently. "A little rain won't stop him." But as the morning progressed and the time for service drew near, Brother Thomas was nowhere to be seen. The villagers began arriving. Despite the increasingly harsh weather, farmers and shopkeepers, elderly grandmothers and young families with children, they shook the rain from their coats and settled into the simple wooden pews, their faces bright with anticipation for the weekly gathering that brought their small community together. Mother Superior stood at the front of the chapel, checking her pocket watch with growing concern. The service was supposed to begin in 10 minutes, and there was still no sign of their organist. The old organ in the corner, a much simpler instrument than the Forbidden's piano, sat silent and waiting. "Perhaps he's just running late because of the weather," suggested Sister Agnes, but her voice carried doubt. Just then, young Paolo Rossi burst through the chapel doors, his clothes soaked from the rain and his face flushed from running. Paula worked at the monastery and often carried messages between the two religious communities. "Mother Superior," he called out breathlessly, drawing the attention of everyone in the chapel. "I have news about Brother Thomas." The chapel fell silent as Paula caught his breath. Margaret felt her heart sink even before he spoke the words she somehow knew were coming. "Brother Thomas fell ill yesterday evening with a terrible fever," Paula announced. "The monastery doctor says it might be pneumonia. He's too sick to travel, and he asked me to tell you how sorry he is to miss the service." A collective sigh of disappointment rippled through the gathered crowd. The children, who especially loved singing along with Brother Thomas's gentle organ playing, looked particularly dejected. Margaret saw little Maria, the baker's daughter, turn to her mother with tears in her eyes. "Will there be no music today, Mama?" the child whispered, but her voice carried in the quiet chapel. Mother Superior cleared her throat and stepped forward to address the congregation. Margaret could see the uncertainty in the older woman's face. This had never happened before, in all their years of community services. "My dear friends," Mother Superior began, her voice echoing in the stone chapel, "as you've heard, Brother Thomas is unable to join us today due to illness. Let us keep him in our prayers for a quick recovery. We will proceed with our service, but I'm afraid we'll have to worship without musical accompaniment today." The disappointment was palpable. Margaret looked around at the faces of the villagers, people who worked hard all week and looked forward to this 1 hour when their voices could rise together in joyful song. She saw Giuseppe, the old farmer whose arthritis made every day a struggle, but who always sang with such passion that it brought tears to her eyes. She saw young Mother Teresa holding her baby while her toddler sat quietly beside her, both children's eyes wide with confusion about why there would be no music. But it was the children's faces that broke Margaret's heart the most. They had been looking forward to singing their favorite hymns, and now they sat in disappointed silence. Not understanding why the adults couldn't simply make music without the organ, Mother Superior moved to begin the service, opening her prayer book and preparing to lead the congregation in spoken prayers. But as she began to speak, Margaret felt something stirring deep in her chest, something that had been building for weeks and could no longer be contained. The music inside her, the melodies that had been trapped for so long, seemed to push against her ribs like a bird beating its wings against a cage. She thought of her grandmother's words from so many years ago. "Music is like prayer, little one. It comes from the heart and goes straight to heaven." These people needed music. They needed the joy and comfort that only song could bring. And Margaret suddenly realized that she had the power to give it to them. Her hands began to tremble as she looked toward the piano in the corner. The beautiful instrument sat there as it had for months, silent and unused, its potential locked away by rules and regulations. But what if those rules were wrong? What if God had put that piano in their chapel not as a temptation or distraction, but as a gift waiting to be unwrapped? Margaret stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The movement caught the attention of several sisters and villagers nearby, who looked at her with curiosity. Mother Superior paused in her prayers, raising an eyebrow at the unusual interruption. "Sister Margaret?" Mother Superior's voice carried a note of warning. "Is everything all right?" For a moment, Margaret almost sat back down. The weight of 47 years of obedience pressed down on her shoulders, and she could feel the disapproving stare of the convent's leader. But then she looked again at little Maria's tearful face, at Giuseppe's disappointed expression, at all the people who had braved the storm to come together in worship and fellowship. "Mother Superior," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger. "These people came here seeking comfort and community. They came expecting to raise their voices in praise together. Music has always been part of worship. Even in the scriptures, David played his harp for the Lord." The chapel had fallen completely silent now. Every eye was fixed on the elderly nun who had never spoken out of turn in nearly 5 decades of religious life. Margaret could feel her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Sister Margaret," Mother Superior said sternly, "please sit down. We will proceed with the service as I have outlined, but Margaret remained standing. She looked around the chapel one more time, at the faces of people she had come to love over the years, at the beautiful piano that held so much potential for joy, at her fellow sisters who had become her family. And in that moment, she made a choice that would change everything. "I'm sorry, Mother Superior," she said, her voice now clear and determined, "but I cannot sit down. Not when I have the ability to give these good people what they came for." With steps that felt both terrifying and liberating, Sister Margaret walked slowly toward the piano. Behind her, she could hear gasps from the congregation and sharp whispers from her fellow nuns. She could feel Mother Superior's shocked stare burning into her back, and she knew there would be consequences for what she was about to do, but as she approached the beautiful instrument, all she could think about was her grandmother's loving hands guiding her fingers across the keys so many years ago. All she could remember was the pure joy that music had brought to her life. Before she had chosen to lock it away, Margaret reached the piano bench and stood beside it for a moment, her weathered hands shaking as she prepared to lift the lid. This was it, the moment she had been both dreading and longing for. In a few seconds, she would either create something beautiful or face the worst trouble of her religious life. She took a deep breath, whispered a quick prayer for courage, and gently opened the piano to reveal the gleaming black and white keys that had been calling to her for so long. The chapel held its collective breath as Sister Margaret, for the first time in nearly 50 years, prepared to make music again. Sister Margaret's fingers trembled as they hovered over the piano keys. The chapel was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Behind her, she sensed the shocked silence of the congregation, villagers who had known her as the quiet, obedient nun for decades, fellow sisters who had never seen her break a rule, and Mother Superior, whose authority had just been challenged for the first time in anyone's memory. For a moment, doubt crept into Margaret's mind. What was she doing? She was 73 years old, and it had been nearly 50 years since she had last played piano. What if her fingers had forgotten how to move? What if the music that lived so vividly in her memory had died somewhere along the way? What if she embarrassed herself and everyone else in the process? But then she looked down at the keys, those beautiful black and white keys that seemed to shimmer in the chapel's dim light, and something magical happened. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if Nonna Rosa were sitting right beside her on the bench. "Don't think so much, little one. Just let your heart speak through your fingers." Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, her hands had settled naturally onto the keys, and suddenly she knew exactly what to play. The melody that came to her was Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had been her grandmother's favorite, the one that had brought tears to congregations' eyes at the small village church, where she had grown up. As her fingers pressed down on the first chord, the sound that filled the chapel was unlike anything anyone there had ever heard. The piano's voice was rich and warm, each note crystal clear and perfectly tuned. But it was more than just the quality of the instrument, it was the way Margaret played it, with a tenderness and emotion that seemed to come from her very soul. The opening notes of Amazing Grace rang out slowly, almost hesitantly, as if Margaret were reintroducing herself to an old friend. But with each passing measure, her confidence grew. Her fingers remembered the patterns they had learned so long ago, and muscle memory that had been sleeping for decades suddenly awakened. The melody flowed from the piano like water from a spring that had been dammed up for too long. Margaret's hands moved across the keys with increasing grace, adding gentle embellishments and harmonies that she had learned from her grandmother. The simple hymn became something extraordinary, not flashy or complicated, but deeply moving in its sincerity. As the first verse concluded, something wonderful happened. Old Giuseppe, the farmer with the arthritic hands, began to sing along in his weathered but strong voice. The words of Amazing Grace filled the chapel, mixing with the piano's melody in perfect harmony. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. One by one, other voices joined in. Teresa, the young mother, sang softly while her baby slept in her arms. The baker and his wife added their voices, followed by the schoolteacher and the blacksmith. Even little Maria, her tears forgotten, began to sing in her clear, sweet child's voice. Margaret felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she played. This was what she had been missing, this connection between music and hearts, this ability to bring people together in something beautiful and sacred. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, and she found herself adding variations to the melody that she didn't even know she remembered. The chapel seemed to transform around them. The gray stone walls that had always felt cold and austere now seemed warm and welcoming. The rain drumming against the windows became a gentle percussion accompanying their song. Even the candles seemed to flicker in time with the music. As they moved into the second verse, Margaret noticed something that made her heart nearly burst with joy. Her fellow sisters were singing too. Sister Catherine's voice joined the chorus first, then Sister Anna's, then others. Even Sister Agnes, who had caught Margaret at the piano that night weeks ago, was singing along with tears in her eyes. The only person not singing was Mother Superior, who stood frozen at the front of the chapel, her face a mixture of shock, anger, and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. But Margaret couldn't worry about that now. The music had taken over and she was simply its vessel when Amazing Grace came to an end. The chapel fell silent for a moment. Then, as if by magic, spontaneous applause broke out. The villagers clapped and wiped their eyes, and several called out words of praise and amazement. "That was beautiful, Sister Margaret. I've never heard anything so lovely. Please play another one." Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, all beaming with joy and wonder. These were the same people who had entered the chapel disappointed and dejected just minutes ago. Now they looked transformed, as if they had witnessed something miraculous. Without hesitation, Margaret's fingers found the keys again, this time playing "How Great Thou Art," another beloved hymn that she knew would resonate with the congregation. Her playing was even more confident now, her hands moving with the grace and skill that had never really left her. Only slept. As she played, Margaret realized that something profound was happening. The decades of prayer, meditation, and spiritual discipline hadn't dulled her musical gift, they had refined it. Her faith had given her playing a depth and emotion that her younger self could never have achieved. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her years of devotion, her struggles, her joys, and her love for the people around her. The congregation sang with even more enthusiasm during the second hymn. Voices that had been tentative during Amazing Grace now rang out with confidence and joy. Margaret watched as neighbors who rarely spoke to each other found themselves singing side by side. United in the beauty of the moment, she noticed young Paula, the messenger boy who had brought the news about Brother Thomas, wiping tears from his eyes as he sang. She saw the village doctor, a man who usually seemed stern and serious, smiling wider than she had ever seen. Even the children were completely enchanted, their faces glowing with wonder at the music filling their small chapel. As the hymn concluded, Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Sister Catherine standing beside the piano bench, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sister Margaret," Catherine whispered, "I had no idea you could play like this. This is this is a gift from God?" Before Margaret could respond, other sisters began gathering around the piano. Sister Anna reached out to touch the keys reverently, as if they were sacred objects. Sister Lucia, the eldest nun after Margaret, herself, took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You have brought such joy to these people," Sister Lucia said softly. "Look at their faces. This is what worship is supposed to feel like." Margaret looked out at the congregation and saw that Sister Lucia was right. The villagers were glowing with happiness, talking excitedly among themselves about the beautiful music. Children who had been restless and fidgety during regular services were now completely captivated, begging their parents to let them stay longer. But then Margaret's eyes found Mother Superior, who still stood at the front of the chapel, her face now clearly showing anger and disapproval. The stern woman's lips were pressed into a thin line, and her hands were clenched at her sides. Margaret knew that this moment of joy would come with a price. Still, as she looked back at the faces of The people who had been so deeply moved by the music, Margaret felt no regret. For the first time in decades, she had been truly herself, not just Sister Margaret the obedient nun, but Margaret the musician, the girl who had learned to speak to hearts through melody. The music that had been locked away for so long was finally free, and it had brought something beautiful into the world. Whatever happened next, she knew that this moment had been worth every year of waiting. The chapel slowly emptied as the villagers reluctantly made their way back into the storm outside, but their faces glowed with a warmth that no rain could wash away. They lingered at the doors, turning back to wave at Sister Margaret, calling out their thanks and asking when she might play again. Little Maria ran back to the piano bench and threw her small arms around the elderly nun's waist. "Sister Margaret, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," the child whispered. "Will you teach me to play someday?" Margaret's heart swelled as she hugged the little girl back. "Perhaps, dear one, perhaps someday we can learn together." As the last of the congregation departed, the chapel fell quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows and the soft footsteps of the remaining sisters. Margaret sat on the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly able to believe what had just happened. After 50 years of silence, she had played again, and it had been even more wonderful than her memories had promised, but the peaceful moment was short-lived. Mother Superior's sharp voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Sister Margaret, please come with me to my office, now." The elderly nun rose slowly from the piano bench, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier to face. The other sisters watched with worried expressions as Margaret followed Mother Superior out of the chapel, their footsteps echoing in the stone corridors. Mother Superior's office was a small, austere room with a simple wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a crucifix on the wall. The older woman sat behind her desk and gestured for Margaret to take the chair across from her. For several long moments they sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Finally, Mother Superior spoke, her voice cold and measured. "In 47 years, Sister Margaret, you have never disobeyed a direct order. You have been a model of religious discipline and devotion. That is why what happened today is so deeply disappointing." Margaret kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were folded in her lap. "I understand your anger, Mother Superior." "Do you?" the stern woman demanded. "Do you understand that you have violated the rules of this community? Do you understand that your actions today undermine my authority in front of the entire congregation?" Margaret looked up then, meeting Mother Superior's angry gaze. "Yes, I understand all of that. But I also understand that those people needed music today. They needed hope and joy, and I had the ability to give it to them. That was not your decision to make." Mother Superior's voice rose slightly, though she quickly composed herself. "We have rules in this community for good reasons. That piano represents worldly temptations that have no place in our spiritual life. But it brought such joy," Margaret said quietly. "You saw their faces? You heard how they sang. How can something that creates such beauty and brings people closer to God be worldly?" Mother Superior stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the rain-soaked courtyard. "You don't understand, Sister Margaret. Once we start making exceptions, where does it end? If you can break the rules when you think it's justified, what stops others from doing the same?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Perhaps some rules are meant to be broken when love demands it. Those people traveled through a storm to worship with us. They were disappointed and sad, and I had the power to change that. How could I not use a gift that God gave me to serve others? God gave you that gift?" Mother Superior turned back to face her, eyebrows raised. "Or is that just what you're telling yourself to justify your disobedience?" Before Margaret could answer, there was a soft knock at the office door. Mother Superior called for whoever it was to enter, and Sister Catherine stepped into the room, her face flushed with nervousness. "Forgive the interruption, Mother Superior, but there are people at our front door asking to speak with you." "Villagers who were at the service today," Mother Superior frowned. "What do they want?" They want to thank you for allowing Sister Margaret to play today. They say it was the most beautiful service they've ever attended, and they're hoping she might play again next Sunday." The room fell silent. Margaret could see the conflict playing across Mother Superior's face, anger at the disobedience, but also awareness that the community had been deeply moved by what had happened. "Tell them I will consider their request," Mother Superior said finally. Sister Catherine nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. The two women sat in silence again, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mother Superior returned to her chair and looked directly at Margaret. "Sister Margaret, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want an honest answer. If I order you never to touch that piano again, will you obey?" Margaret felt her heart sink. She had hoped that seeing the joy on the villagers' faces might have softened Mother Superior's position, but it seemed the woman was determined to maintain her strict stance. Margaret began, then stopped. How could she promise something she wasn't sure she could keep? The music had awakened something in her that felt essential to who she was. Could she really lock it away again after experiencing such joy? "I'm waiting for an answer, Sister Margaret." "I honestly don't know," Margaret said finally. "I don't want to be disobedient, but I also can't promise to ignore a gift that brings such happiness to others." Mother Superior's expression remained stern, but Margaret thought she detected something softer in her eyes. "You realize this puts me in an impossible position. I cannot allow open defiance of the rules, but I also cannot ignore the impact your playing had on our community." Over the next few days, word of Sister Margaret's piano playing spread far beyond their small village. People from neighboring towns began visiting the convent, hoping to hear the elderly nun play. Local newspapers picked up the story of the 73-year-old sister, who had hidden her musical talents for nearly 50 years, a young journalist named Roberto, who had grown up in their village but now worked for a city newspaper, came to interview Margaret. He was amazed by her story and asked if he could record her playing on his phone to share with his readers. "I just want to capture a little bit of the magic," he explained. "People need to hear this story. In a world full of sadness and division, stories like yours remind us that beauty and hope still exist." Margaret looked to Mother Superior, who had been present during the interview. The stern woman's expression was unreadable, but after a long moment, she gave a small nod. Margaret sat at the piano and played Amazing Grace once more, pouring all of her heart into the simple melody. Roberto recorded every note, tears streaming down his face as he listened to the pure emotion in her playing. When he published the article online with the recording, something extraordinary happened. The story went viral within hours. People from around the world shared the video of Sister Margaret playing, adding their own comments about how the music had touched their hearts. The simple recording reached millions of people, bringing hope and beauty into lives that desperately needed both. Television crews arrived at the convent. Music producers called, offering to arrange concert tours. The story spread to major news networks, and suddenly Sister Margaret's quiet convent was at the center of international attention. But perhaps the most surprising call came from Vatican City itself. A representative of the Pope had heard the story and wanted to invite Sister Margaret to play at a special interfaith service celebrating the power of music in worship. As Margaret sat in Mother Superior's office, listening to the woman read the official invitation from Rome, she could hardly believe what was happening. Her small act of defiance had somehow touched hearts around the world. "It seems," Mother Superior said slowly, setting down the letter from the Vatican, "that God has plans for your music that are far bigger than our small convent rules." Margaret looked at the woman who had been her spiritual leader for so many years and saw something she had never seen before: humility and perhaps even a hint of pride. "Sister Margaret," Mother Superior continued, "I believe I owe you an apology. And I believe our community owes you something as well, the freedom to use the gift God gave you to bring joy to others." From that day forward, the piano at St. Catherine's Convent was no longer forbidden. Sister Margaret played every Sunday for the community services, and people traveled from far and wide to hear her music. She never did take up the offers for concert tours or recording contracts, but She did accept the invitation to play at the Vatican, where her simple, heartfelt music moved even the most powerful religious leaders to tears. The piano that had once sat silent in the corner became the heart of their chapel, and Sister Margaret's music became a bridge that connected their small community to the wider world. Her story reminded everyone who heard it that it's never too late to share your gifts, and that sometimes the most beautiful moments come when we have the courage to let our hearts speak louder than our fears.